surgery according to no.
I went through that years ago. Wasn't fun. At the end, it felt like somebody took a 2x4 and attacked me. But during it wasn't.
Maybe it was in your case, they actually did hit you with a 2x4.
Well, I feel like doing it every now and then, so.
You never
You
know.
never know. Not very often, it doesn't work. Just about as often as you feel like getting after me with
So is it a knee or a hip? Huh?
Me.
A knee, okay.
Knee replacement.
Because I asked you,
Would it be better?
How'd you
if I,
do?
like, went up
Walking.
there, would they be more room?
does well.
That didn't answer the question though.
Would that help?
I'm
Was there an
walking,
open
I'm
seat
walking
up there?
too.
There's not an.
It's rough for a
open
while
seat,
and
but I don't know
then
if
he's
there's
glad
like
he did it, right?
Just more space.
Make sure you do all of this.
For laptop.
And the ice.
Yeah, yes. And you keep your leg iced.
How
Once
long
Yeah.
you get a nice
As much as you
machine,
can.
get a nice
I'm Meryl.
machine,
Oh, they give you
Nice
one
to
at the
meet you.
hospital.
yeah,
Hi.
and keep that on for
As much as you can.
4 or 5 days,
Yeah.
Oh, it was 2 weeks,
2 weeks.
at least,
She got up at night and refreshed it, and
probably.
was on your
unhitched me when I
kitchen.
needed to be unhitched. And have someone get
Hopefully
someone
it's
to
not
help you
bad.
with meals and everything.
And what?
Help you with meals.
You mean like put it in my mouth?
Yeah, not like that'll be.
Or speed you.
Regularly.
Whereas this way also. Cause you'll be all cooked up with the ice
I
cream.
won't be able to do what?
Cook.
Me cook? I couldn't cook before.
That's like the joke.
Cook after
Will you be
me.
able to cook? Well, you put
Watch
my
the
floor.
violin.
Joel, you and David are more alike than you want to say.
Pardon?
Will you be able to get the food you need?
Well, unless my wife decides that she doesn't like me anymore.
Well,
By the way, I have a friend who's doing
Something
a
beeping.
lecture.
Right,
Yes.
yeah, this
Faith lecture
machine, this chair
on Jewish
Oh.
saints and
is
martyrs.
beeping, I know,
What is a
it's,
Jewish saint? You
so I don't
know
know.
a Jewish saint?
There's a way to, yeah.
there is the Hebrew word kiddushim, which it translates holy. Probably he's going to talk about people who have been singled out for their holiness. But it's not exactly the same thing as the
No,
Catholic
certainly
notion
not.
of a saint.
Certainly would not be the same.
But that's my guess, that's what he's going to do.
And she has.
There's plenty of Jewish
Put it out the
martyrs.
door.
Oh, yeah, that, and they've been ever
Something in
since.
there.
There's
I don't
plenty
know.
of martyrs to go around, so you can,
They need shoes. Of a solid.
yeah, that's, who knows? Who knows?
So where are you getting your surgery?
Something in the water.
At least, no, let me know.
I went and got some because I know that my throat dries up.
Dick Forrester.
Okay,
Yeah.
he is
You can
a
turn it
good
off.
surgeon.
Thank you.
He is terrible on it.
Oh, he's terrible in pre-care.
He did my first leg, and I,
Don't.
any problems afterwards, he was in denial that had anything to do with the surgery. And gave me no advice other than, your leg is perfect, you can go. Well, no, it's not perfect. No, my blessing from my aunt. He's a good surgeon,
He did a
he's
good
not a
job.
good doctor. I'll put it like that. But very good surgeon.
Anyway,
I'm waiting the additional minute because then the last person comes in.
and then, yeah.
And Peggy has to come back in. Okay. So I adjusted my plan for this class a little bit. We will do the things that I had originally planned, but I made an adjustment. And I'll try to make that clear in a second. But I thought we would start with something from the book of Numbers, which you have a long ways till you get back to it in the cycle. Those of you that are following the Torah reading cycle, you just started Genesis, right? So you have to get all the way through Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, and then you come to Numbers. And Numbers, which is filled, it's one of my favorite things. It's filled with great stories, narratives, all sorts of really, really interesting things. But most modern Jews are not very familiar with these stories. not like we're familiar with the stories in Genesis, right? Or familiar even with all the great story in Exodus, if for no other reason because of the Haggadah. But Numbers, you see, comes in the summer. And we all know that God is on vacation in the summer and religious life sort of goes on hiatus. There's no religious school. And so historically, I put myself in this category too. People just don't know the book of Numbers. You start to pick it up again with Deuteronomy because usually in the fall, you're still at the end, in the second half of Deuteronomy before you get to the high holidays and you end up finishing Deuteronomy and starting Genesis again, which is what happened next week. But in Numbers, among other things, there is a passage that we begin services with. That's how famous it is. In the Reform movement in the United States, not every service begins with it, but traditionally most services begin with it. It's called Ma Tovu. Are you familiar with this prayer? Ma Tovu, Alecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael. And if it's a very sophisticated singing congregation, you can turn that into a round. And it can really be very nice. And do we know where that comes from?
I guess it comes from
Parshat
Numbers.
Bilam.
It comes from Parshat Bilam. Actually, it's Parshat Balak,
Oh, that's right, Parshat.
but it's about Bilam. So Joel can be forgiven if he's a little confused about that. It's the story of Bilam, which is a story about a non-Jew who somehow has a relationship with God. And it's a story that is filled with kind of humor and importance, right? You know who Bilam was, or in English, he is called Balaam. Bilam is this seer, prophet, who Balak, that's who the Torah portion is named for, who is the king of Moab, wants to hire Bilam to curse the Israelites because Balak is afraid of the Israelites. And Bilam, I guess he's a prophet for hire. And I guess he has the reputation that if he curses you, you are really cursed. And so Balak is very insistent. Do we know the way the story goes? The way the story goes is Bilam is ready to be hired. However, God has other things in mind. And there's this famous passage on the road where Bilam is riding on his donkey and his donkey stops. Otherwise, he's known as Bilam's ass or Balaam's ass. He stops because he sees a being in front of him, a fiery being holding a sword. But of course, the donkey can see what the seer cannot see, right? Anyway, it turns out he can't curse the Israelites unless God wants him to curse the Israelites. And so he doesn't curse the Israelites. That's the way we're usually taught the passage. Instead, he says, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov. How goodly are your tents, Jacob. Mishkenotecha Yisrael, your dwelling places, Israel. And that became the song. That's what everybody knows from the poem. See? You have to start before the last person.
Sorry.
Hi, come on.
Okay.
Okay. However, it's a long poem. And I'm not going to read you all of it, but let me read you verse 9 of the poem. In verse 9, it says, "For from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him." Who's him?
God.
I think it's Israel. Lo, it is a people that dwells alone. For from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. For lo, it is a people that dwells alone, and shall not be reckoned among the nations. No, we don't sing that part. Is that a blessing or a curse? For Israel is to be a people that dwells alone and is not reckoned among the nations.
That seems to support the idea of chosenness, that we are a single nation, chosen by God, so we dwell alone.
Well, let's, you were rolling there till we dwell alone. That's the last 4 words.
And
Does everybody here agree with that? That that's what it means to be chosen, to be separated?
It's the opposite.
example.
Necessarily, yeah.
Well, I agree with Aaron, that's what Bilam said. Now, what Bilam says, which is supposed to be the great blessing, I'm not so sure is a blessing.
It sounded like a curse to me.
But you asked a different question. You asked about chosenness.
I didn't ask that. Aaron brought that
Oh,
up.
Aaron brought it up.
Yeah.
Let's keep this straight. You're getting your knee fixed. He talked about chosen. In seriousness, this is the issue, it seems to me, that there are 2 great Jewish communities in the world. For the last 2 sessions and last Sunday morning, I spent a lot of time talking about the largest Jewish community in the world, which is in the state of Israel. There's no doubt about that anymore, by the way. The Jewish community in Israel, in real numbers, is certainly at least 7 million. Maybe a little more. The population in the state of Israel is around 10 million. Here, numbers are not quite so clear. We don't have a national census that we can rely on. I mean, they do ask you questions in the national census, but you don't have to answer them. And then it's a matter of who counts as a Jew. So if you talk to the Jewish Federation of Cincinnati, they will tell you that the Jewish community has not shrunk at all in Cincinnati since I was a student there in the 70s. If you talk to the Jewish Federation in St. Louis, they'll tell you the same thing. I haven't checked here, but it wouldn't surprise me if you found something similar here, although it's hard to ignore the fact that the Jewish community of Dayton is half the size that it was in the 70s, if that. But do you follow what I mean? In other words, you can read studies out there, particularly if they're from Leonard Sachs, who is the great Jewish demographer, who is at Brandeis, who is sort of the godfather of this. The way he counts Jews, there's probably 20 or 30 million Jews in the United States. That's an exaggeration. He counts essentially anybody who identifies themselves to the Jewish community in any way. So that means if you're married to somebody who's Jewish and you are living in that kind of household, you might get counted as being Jewish. It's very unclear, but I think a reasonable number anyway is that maybe we're still at 6 million in the United States. I personally am not persuaded by that number because I'm more interested in the number of Jews that actually identify and are out there as Jews, and it means something to them, than the ones who check a certain box. And if you look at the affiliation rates in the United States, then you'll have those numbers. Cut them in half for sure. Okay. But being that, and I said this to somebody on Sunday morning, if I have a role, I think someone will agree with this, but I never speak for my wife. It's very dangerous. If I have a role, it's to help Israelis understand American Jews and help American Jews understand Israelis. Because we have more than a foot in each, in each location. And I am to the core of my being American. And if you talk to any Israeli that knows me, that Israeli would say, oh yeah, absolutely, not really Israeli, definitely American. That's a good thing, sometimes not a good thing, but it's a thing, it's reality. So I'm very interested in the American side of the equation also. And so next week, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about that relationship per se, but here I want to focus on the American side for a minute and ask ourselves, how do we understand who we are as Jews? Do we accept what Bilam says, that we are supposed to be a nation that lives apart? And if we accept that, which I don't think we do, by the way, at least not in the liberal community, but if we do accept that, what does it mean? What does it mean? So I want to do that. And then I want to get to Hillel's material also, which is what I advertised. Okay? So if you want to, we're going to look at a bunch of text. Yeah, you might want to go like the whole thing. And we need at least, when that gets to the end, if you want to make sure that. And so like every week I say, I wish that I had the experience and background to have come up with all these passages on my own, that would just be a lie. The reality is that the classes that I take every summer, the teachers provide us these materials and they want us to use them, and I'm fulfilling their desire on using them. All right, so we're going to take a look at a little bit of initially about what this means to be, or might mean, and what we think it means to be a nation that dwells alone, of which the other nations of the world really don't really count. Now remember, the tradition is going to look at that passage and take it very seriously. Okay, so we're going to look at this guy, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. We're 19th century guy in Russia. He's going to tell us what it means to be a nation to live alone. I'm curious about your reaction. A nation that dwells alone, not like all other peoples and languages which go into exile and become mixed in with those who exiled them, thereby attaining love and importance in the eyes of the other more than they would have if they had remained separate. He's saying, we're not like that. We're not like that. Not so Israel. When it is alone, when it does not mix in with them, it dwells in comfort and dignity. Did everybody get that? When it does not mix in with them, it dwells in comfort and dignity. And all the nations of the earth will see that God's name is called upon, that's Israel, and no one threatens or challenges Israel. And among the nations, when Israel wants to mix in with them, it is not considered, the nations do not consider Israel to even be human. Remember, 19th century Russia. He's right. What did he say?
He's right.
Did I say he's right?
Oh, I thought you just said he's right.
No, I'm asking you. What did he say?
Oh, what did he say?
What did he say? Let's make sure we understand him, first of all. Does he think that we should be mixing in the countries that we find ourselves?
No.
No.
It should be in the shtetl.
Well, for him, he probably was in the shtetl. I mean, it's not, I actually don't know enough about him to know exactly where he lived, but 19th century Russia,
Listen to me.
he was in the Pale of Settlement would be my guess. Okay, but what he's saying is, this blessing is that we are intended to live alone and not mix in, and the others respect us when we don't mix in. When we do try to mix in, they think we're not human. Okay, has anybody been watching the news lately?
He didn't even watch Fiddler on the Roof.
I wanted to talk about the American Jewish community. Does this have any resonance? Yeah.
I'm not sure how this fits in exactly. However, my mom grew up in a family that came from Eastern Europe, as did my father. She never ate a piece of non-kosher food until she was forced to Springfield by the war. Her father had small fingers and fixed watches, so they drafted him in order to,
Okay.
because his hands could feel. Then everybody became successful. My mom did what she could. She sent three of my four brother and my sisters to Hillel Academy. I continued on. My sister continued on somewhat on her own. Barry and Judy consider themselves to be Jewish, however, to me, Judaism's still one of the most important things to me, and I'm extremely lonely because of that. And my brother intermarried, and I said it's much worse than it seems.
So are you suggesting that you are dwelling alone? The Jewish people is dwelling alone.
Just me. My brother married a non-Jew who became Jewish, however, and it may just be their own personalities, but of their 3 children, I don't think any of them will raise Jewish families.
So the issue that you're commenting on the issue. I'm trying to start at the most basic level with who we are supposed to be. So this guy would have said, we should never be trying to mix in at all. Now that is certainly the opposite of the approach that liberal Judaism took.
What nation that we ended up in as a community let us in?
Okay, so now from his perspective, he could have made that argument that they won't let you in anyway. And he does say that at the end, right? They'll think of you as less than human, even if you try. But he is arguing a positive, not a negative. They aren't going to let. He said we shouldn't. That's not who we are. That is not who we are. And from his perspective, I think it's much more easy to understand than from the American experience. I try to make a case at the end on Sunday morning that we are the community who believed that we were safe in America. And now we're not so sure. We're not so sure. And he seems to be arguing, that's right. You were wrong to start with. You were wrong to start with. Okay, let's keep going. It's only where the check marks are, so you have to turn the page. We don't have time to read all of it.
Well, I have a statement,
Mhm.
because I thought in a lot of the classes that I've taken from you and from other people, is that the only thing that saved Jews in America was the assimilation.
Okay, that's the argument. The argument was that we successfully assimilated in the United States. And I'm just saying the last year has caused many, if not all, but many to question that. Okay, let's look just to show you how this question runs throughout all of our tradition. Esther, chapter 3, verse 8, right? Purim. There's a lot of noise when you're hearing the Megillah. So you can't really hear the book of Esther when you're at a Megillah reading. If you actually want to know what's in the book of Esther, you have to read it as a book, not just listen to it ritually when we're reading and making noise. And I'm sort of guilty about this because I instituted the whole thing as throwing candy, which just turns the whole thing into chaos. It's fun chaos, but it's chaos. Okay, what does Haman say about the Jews? And remember, in the book of Esther, they're called Jews. They're not Hebrews, they're not Israelites, they're Jews. There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people and who do not obey the king's laws. And it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. This is Haman's argument that works, right? Apparently, Ahasuerus, as we call him in English. It's not easier to say Ahasuerus than Ahasuerus, so I don't know why we chose that, but he buys it, at least passively. And what does it almost lead to?
Nice. Slaughter.
Annihilation, exactly right. All right, so what is the argument? Is it true?
Well, I thought somewhere we were told that we should obey the laws of the land that we are in.
You are correct. That's rabbinic. The rabbinic rule is dina machuta dina. The law of the land is the law. So, but look at the first part of Haman's argument. There's a certain people, there are people, but they're scattered, and their laws are different than the rest of us. Is that true?
Yeah.
That's true. But then the kicker is, but they don't obey the king's law, which is what we've always been accused of.
But doesn't the Babylonian exile militate against that point of view?
How do you mean?
When we were exiled, we fit in very nicely, did a lot of good stuff, and most of them wanted to stay there.
Well, most of them did stay.
Yeah.
They didn't want, they did. However, in Babylonia, they were not required to assimilate. They were allowed to maintain their own identity. They had their own leader, the Exilarch, and they had their own academies of learning. So the Babylonian system was not the Assyrian system. The Assyrian system was to force assimilation, right? You move populations from one place and other populations in, you change everybody around so that everybody's discombobulated and they're easier to control when you assimilate them. That's not what the Babylonians did. First of all, they didn't exile everybody, mostly only the leadership, and they allowed them to maintain their own identity. But Joel's 100% correct that they thrived in Babylon. No doubt about that. And when Persia allows them to return, most don't. Most stay. Okay, but I wanted you to see how deep this question is. Look at Exodus. Passover story. We've done Purim. Let's look at Passover. Yaakov melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. A new king arose over Egypt who knew not Joseph. Right? I think it's in the first chapter of Exodus. And what did he say to his people? Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let's deal shrewdly with them so they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies and rise up from the ground. This is a classic indictment of Jews also. The Jews represent what? A fifth column. Right? Isn't that what it's called? Fifth column? I think. I'm not sure of my English idioms anymore. Okay, but do you see that biblically, this is already an issue? Are we supposed to be different or not? And if we are supposed to be different, how are we supposed to be different? And is it a good thing that we're different?
I think the more where we are ourselves, the more those who are not us respect us.
Okay, we'll see. We'll see. So look at what Rabbeinu Bachia says. I forgot to look him up. I don't remember where he's from. When Israel was in exile in Egypt, they weren't able to perform circumcision. Now, you should know that this is an exact opposite of what the Midrash says. The Midrash says that they were allowed to be redeemed, freed from Egypt, because they kept a handful of mitzvot. One of them is they didn't change their names. And another one was they continued to circumcise themselves. However, this guy, on his commentary to Numbers 23:9, a nation that dwells alone, he says they weren't able to perform circumcision.
Spanish.
He's Spanish, okay. They said, we will become like the Egyptians. Now, modern scholars actually say the opposite. You familiar with this? Modern scholars often say it was the Egyptians that did circumcision and that's where the Jews got it from. He is saying, no. We wanted to be like the Egyptians and they were not circumcised, so we did not circumcise. So what did God do? God caused the Egyptians to hate God's people. This means that God thought that because they were in exile, it was fitting for them not to remain distinct from the Egyptians. But in the end, the reverse is what happened. The Egyptians separated themselves from Israel. In other words, he's trying to argue, God wants you to be separate. When you try not to be separate, that's when they hate you. Exactly what you just said. You didn't know you were in agreement with him. You're in agreement with him. You see this point of view? You see we have a point of view that says You should be separate. Should be separate. God does not like it when you don't. Now let's look at somebody more modern. Modern, but more modern, Theodor Herzl. We've all heard of him, right? From something called Der Judenstaat, which there are people here that know German, but I am led to believe that there's a difficulty in how to translate this word, whether it really means the Jewish state or it means the state of Jews. And those are two very different things. Jewish state.
City.
So, no, stat in this case means state.
And state.
Judenstaat, Jewish state. But what does he mean by Jewish state? Is it a state that is Jewish, or is it a state that that's where the Jews are? So he said, for him, he doesn't answer this question. It didn't rise for him because that's not what he's focused on. We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We want to assimilate, we want to preserve. We are not permitted to do so. In vain, we are loyal patriots. Our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers. If we could only be left in peace, but I think we shall not be left. This is his argument for political Zionism. You can read the whole corpus if you want, but this is in a nutshell is what he's arguing. Doesn't matter what we do, they're not accepting us.
It's because he was failed at assimilation.
Oh,
He wasn't accepted.
he was
he
completely,
tried.
that's not true. He was completely accepted as in some way to Jew.
It was very
Everything
precious.
he did in terms of plays, et cetera, were failed. I mean, they
No, but
never
he
had
was
any
a,
success.
he was a successful journalist. I would say the guy who wrote Judenstaat that 50 years later led to the Jewish state after nearly 2,000 years could be counted as a success. But I understand what you're saying, except he was a fully, completely assimilated German Jew, Austrian Jew, totally. And what the mythological story that is told is that when he covered the Dreyfus trial as a journalist and saw that Dreyfus, who was more French than any Frenchman who ever lived, except that he happened to be Jewish, was convicted not once but twice, simply because he was Jewish, that convinced him that assimilation would not work. In truth, he was already convinced before he covered the trial. But it's just an example. He's probably thinking of Dreyfus in this paragraph when he says it doesn't matter what we do.
Austria also, just as much as like.
But your point is, I think a germane one, which is how well have we succeeded in our assimilation? He said we want to talk about America. And again, I think if we had had this conversation a year ago, we would have said we're succeeding very well. Yes, there's anti-Semitism. I would have said, first person singular. Yes, there's anti-Semitic incidents, but not the way it was in my father's time, not even the way it was in my youth in the 50s, and that we are succeeding. Today, I don't know that I do know. I could not make those statements, not with the same degree of confidence. And so Herzl's words are sort of standing out. Did he know something that we didn't know?
There wasn't any group that tried harder to assimilate than the Jews in Germany, and look what happened there.
Well, yeah, he's in Austria, but it's the same difference.
Yeah.
Exactly right. It's the same difference. Okay. A little further. Do we know what the Tosefta is? All right, so the Tosefta is sort of like the Mishnah. Do we know what the Mishnah is? So the Mishnah is the first authoritative rabbinic law code. The Talmud starts with the Mishnah. The commentary, the addition to the Mishnah is called the Gemara, and you put them together and you have the Talmud. However, not everything that was being taught by the rabbis was included in the Mishnah. And so most scholars think that much of it is in another collection called the Tosefta. There's lots of parallel passages between the Mishnah and the Tosefta, but there are some things in the Tosefta that aren't in the Mishnah. And then there is many, many things in the Talmud that are called Braita, or Braitot, plural, which are from the time of the Mishnah, but were not included in the Mishnah. So we know that there was lots and lots of rabbinic teaching, even authoritative teaching, that Judah HaNasi, Judah the Prince, did not include in his Mishnah, which became then the authoritative collection. But we still read the Tosefta, we still have it, because it's from that time period and it's full of authoritative teaching. Okay? So this is from Gittin, which is the section on divorce documents.
So what's the time period?
That I on purpose didn't say it. All right, so most scholars think that it's Tannaitic, which means up to the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. I had one teacher that thought it was much later than that. Yeah, Wacholder. He thought it was much later than that. But most scholars think it's Tannaitic, which means the earliest strata of rabbinic teachings, the 1st century before the Common Era up into the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. So a long time ago. In a city that has both Jews and Gentiles, those who oversee the communal fund should collect from both Jews and Gentiles for the sake of peace. Mipnei darkei shalom, if you're curious what the Hebrew is. So should they distribute to the poor Gentile and the poor Jew alike, mipnei darkei shalom, for the sake of peace. One should eulogize and bury the deceased Gentile, mipnei darkei shalom. And one should comfort the mourning Gentile, mipnei darkei shalom, for the sake of peace. What is this phrase, for the sake of peace? What do you think it means?
Why aren't they burying the Jew and comforting the mourning?
Oh, no, they're assuming that.
Oh, okay.
They're assuming that. They're assuming that Jews will comfort mourning Jews, that Jews will bury dead Jews. They're assuming all that. Okay, so here, what do we know from this passage? Are Jews living alone? Are they living separate? Clearly they are, right? So the question rises, do we bury Gentiles? Is that obligatory upon us?
It's not obligatory, but as you say,
He says it is obligatory.
it's for the purpose of keeping peace, which means for good relations between.
That's still obligatory.
Yeah.
That's obligatory. Mipnei darkei shalom, literally, because of the ways of peace. That's literally word for word what it says, for the sake of peace. What I read there is they have an issue, which is, remember what was said above? We want it to be separate. We also want to be involved. We want to be assimilated. We want both. We want to maintain who we are, a separate identity, but we also want to be wherever we live.
I read that they want to bottle them up in order to live well, to have peace. Otherwise, the Gentiles will be hating us if we don't do anything for them.
Okay, everybody get that? That Mipnei darkei shalom is a way of saying, this is common sense, folks, right? We want to get along with these people. We want them to like us. So we had better comfort them when they are mourning. We had better bury their dead when somebody's dead. What else did it say? Oh, the communal fund. What is a communal fund?
We talking about the Jewish communal fund?
Yeah, the Jewish communal fund.
And a Jewish communal fund is gonna collect from
I'm
Gentiles?
telling you what's in the Tosefta. What's in the Tosefta says that the Jewish communal fund, the tzedakah fund, you better use with Gentiles also, not just Jews.
But it says
And it
collect.
says, yeah, you need to be part of the community you're living in. Right? You need to be part of the community you're living in. You need to go to them and say, we're going to bury your dead too. You need to contribute to the fund. We're going to help take care of all the poor. You need to contribute to the fund. But all of this is from some high-minded, value-oriented, that this is the values of Jewish life, that we believe in taking care of everybody, that we're all created in the image of God, and therefore every human is the same as every other human. And so therefore, is that what the argument is? No, the argument is, this is practical. This is what makes sense, folks. You better do it. I think that there's some real wisdom here. And I think that the American Jewish community has always followed this, has always tried to follow this wisdom. When I was younger, some of you may remember, it was conventional wisdom that Jews didn't run for office. We supported Gentiles who were running for office. Why did we do that? Do you remember that, or am I the only one who's had this experience?
I mean, all the aldermen in our section of Chicago were Jewish. And I'm earlier than you.
Yeah, but
I'm
that's
talking about the 40s and 50s.
but that's Chicago.
We had a Jewish lady.
In Chicago, yeah, but the general rule was it was more prudent for Jews not to be up front.
Can I give you just a personal glimpse in South America where I was living? The stores were, you would say, the majority were in Jewish hands. And the few natives who had stores were starting to mumble. They were not happy.
Grumble.
So the Jewish community got together and they raised the fund. And somehow they compensated them in some way. That was a one time that I know that ever happened.
It's the same kind of thinking, which is we're going to be viewed as different. And actually, we want to be different, but not so different that something bad happens. Okay, so I thought just because we saw the earlier passages that we should see this passage too. Okay, let's turn to the page, to the Babylonian Talmud. Now this is the Talmud itself, this is Gittin. But now we're talking about in the Talmud itself. Okay. One does not protest against poor Gentiles who come to take gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and the produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor on account of the ways of peace. The sages taught in a Baraita, that's an addition, it happens in a Tosefta, one sustains poor Gentiles along with poor Jews, and one visits sick Gentiles along with sick Jews, and one buries dead Gentiles along with dead Jews. All this is done on account of the ways of peace. So you see, even in the Talmud itself, you get the same idea. It quotes the passage that we just read. But is this going too far? So do we know who Rashi is? Who's Rashi?
He's a French commentator, 11th century or something like that.
Yes,
On the Torah.
12th century. But he's the commentator. All the commentating tradition starts with Rashi, right? Rashi is a acronym. His name is Rav Shimon ben Yitzchak. Simon Yitzchaki.
All the bread books I remember also had Rashi.
Everybody, it always starts with Rashi. Rashi is always there. So Rashi is not so sure about what we just read in the Talmud. He has a complete commentary on the Talmud. So he says, you notice that it says with dead Jews. One buries the dead Gentile along with dead Jews, which Rashi then says means not in the graves of Jews, but one takes care of them if one finds them killed along with Jews. In other words, is it our job to go out and bury non-Jews? No. Do we bury them in our cemeteries? No. But if we find somebody, then we take care of it. Do you see how he's trying to walk a middle ground here? He's modifying what was in the Tosefta and what is in the Talmud. Yes.
I'm curious as to what we did with the bodies of the terrorists after October 7th that were left in Israel.
No one talks about that, to my knowledge. And that's, the reason no one talks about that is because they're probably being held.
The bodies are?
Probably. Not all of them, some were buried, but to my knowledge, and my knowledge is incomplete here, I want to state that, but who knows what the details of a deal will be. And I know that that sounds pretty callous, but.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at another guy, Rashba, Spain. We're talking about 13th century. The rabbis taught that dead non-Jews are buried with dead Jews. Rashi explains that this doesn't mean literally in the cemetery of Jews, but that their corpses should be taken care of if found alongside the corpses of Jews. It appears from his interpretation that the text is being precise with the words with dead Jews, means specifically at the same time as taking care of Jewish corpses. Because in that scenario, hatred towards Jews would result if they took care of the Jewish corpses, but left the non-Jewish corpses as they were. But if non-Jewish corpses were found alone, they should not be dealt with this is obviously a mistake in the way as it could be explained by saying one cannot be made to be impure by the corpse or with other explanations from the laws of Avodah Zarah. I don't want to get into the weeds and all this. In other words, there's technicalities here. But this interpretation does not appear to me to be correct. For the phrase with dead Jews means in the same way. And so it is taught that non-Jewish poor people should be provided for alongside Jewish poor people, and such in all cases. Similarly, it is well known that in the Jerusalem Talmud, we teach that in a city where there are both non-Jews and Jews, one appoints a Jewish representative and a non-Jewish representative to administer the charitable funds, and taxes both the Jews and non-Jews, and provides for both the Jews and non-Jews. And we visit Jewish and non-Jewish sick, buries both Jewish and non-Jewish dead, comforts both Jewish and non-Jewish mourners because of the ways of peace. Indeed, the Tosefta further elaborates without mentioning Jews at all in each category that we should eulogize non-Jewish dead because of the ways of peace, and we should comfort non-Jewish mourners because of the ways of peace. Do we see the dialectic going back and forth here? How much should we really be involved and mixed into the society we live in, and how much should we be separate? I think it's the contemporary issue. Okay. Is there a question about that, or can we move on? I want to go to 16. Babylonian Talmud. What are the circumstances that cause desecration of God's name? Rab, this is one of the big names in rabbinic tradition, said, for example, in the case of someone like me, if I take meat from a butcher and do not give him money immediately, that's desecrating God's name. What does he mean, somebody like me?
That he's successful, he has the money.
Oh, he has the money. That's not the issue.
He's educated and knows.
I can't hear you.
He's educated and knows that's the rule.
That's correct. And more
He's
than that.
Jewish.
What?
He's Jewish.
And
It's not the rest of the community.
everybody knows he's a leader of the Jewish community. So if he delays paying the butcher, what does everybody say? And you know that so-and-so Rob, he walked out with the meat, he didn't even pay the butcher until tomorrow. What does that do to the Jewish community?
It's an example.
It's a bad example, right? And tell me your immediate reaction. Ivan Boesky.
Yeah, for the Jewish community.
Bernie Madoff. What's your reaction? In other words, if you're somebody who's prominent in the Jewish community, you have to be extra careful. You have to be extra careful, because that's why he says somebody like me. If I take meat, he doesn't say I'm stealing it, I just don't give him money immediately. Abaye said they taught this statement of Rob only in a place where they do not ask. In other words, where it's not normal to delay paying. But in a place where they ask for money from the customer sometime later, then there's no problem with that. In other words, if it's the norm that the customer takes the meat now and pays later, okay, then Rob is on the same standard as everybody else. But where there's an expectation, even an unsaid expectation, that everybody pays immediately, the leaders of the community better behave that way. In the rabbinic world, we used to call this is not in fashion anymore, but we used to call this being a symbolic exemplar. The younger generations after me came to chafe at that designation. But that's what we were taught. That in essence, whether you liked it or not, you were in a fishbowl. I think it's exactly what Rob is saying. But how do you get along in the society how does the minority group, the separate group, the Jews, how do they get along in the larger society? Okay.
I think in a sense that was communicated to almost every Jewish family. That we had to be careful and be better and be honest and, because.
Even when you had a Jewish alderman.
You were an example.
You should know that in Chicago, aldermen are kind of like little princes in their ward.
And you paid $5 for every vote. It was a big deal.
But okay, do we see the point? I don't want to belabor it if we see it. Okay, questions about this, because this is all about dwelling alone before we get to Hillel. So what are we getting from this passage about Ma tovu alecha? Is dwelling alone a blessing or a curse? My answer is yes. And I think we're living it now. Maybe I've got this wrong. Maybe I'm somehow more sensitive than everyone else, but my sense is people are anxious today. The Jewish community is anxious and is not sure. Things that we thought we knew, we're no longer so certain about. One of them was that we thought that we had established ally relationships across the country that we're not so sure of anymore. I'm the only one that feels that?
No, I think at some point there's gonna be another migration to Israel of Jews.
If I were you, I wouldn't hold your breath. But I understand your feeling. But if I'm right about this, that we're nervous in the sense that things that we thought we understood and that were real, we're no longer sure of, then we're asking ourselves the question about what is our place here. I think that's what Jeff was trying to say. What is our place here? I know it's unfair of me to put words in your mouth, but I'll do it anyway. What is our place? How far can we go? How comfortable can we be? How wary do we need to be? When I was a kid, the thought that we had to have guards at synagogues and churches didn't enter my mind. Today, we would say you're being foolhardy and imprudent at the least if we don't. Right?
And I mean, political affiliations that were once taken for granted are, kind of turned on their heads sometimes.
Yes. I'm thinking specifically about allies. I'm a believer that very little gets accomplished alone. That the way you accomplish things is by forming relationships and alliances and working together, and that involves some degree of compromise, but it's the only way to really get things done. And we thought that there were grand associations that were made. The Jewish community, I'm talking, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. And then in the last year, maybe we could say 2 years, and some people would argue in the last 6 years since Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, if I'm remembering right, is 2018. That it's getting harder and harder to rely on the alliances, to have confidence in them, to know how to proceed with them.
He's talking specifically, that's my biggest bugaboo, the Black community.
So to be specific, in my time here, it was easy. Now, I want to make my disclaimer again. I am speaking for me. Tina left the room, but if she was here, I'd say, not speaking for any of the rabbis here. I'm not speaking for the board here. I am not speaking for the building here. I am not speaking for anybody but me, because I know what happens. This is being recorded, and who knows what happens with it. Is in my time as the rabbi here, it was easy to maintain the relationship with Omega Baptist Church. We all felt that we were allies on certain key things, and that we could celebrate that during Martin Luther King weekend. I was not here last year. I have no idea what's happening this year. Stay there. But I don't think it's as easy now.
Since you have two heads, I would like to ask.
Did you say two heads?
Two heads.
Two heads.
That's why I had in America.
Yeah.
How much has contributed the poor poor public relations of the state of Israel, number one. The second place, the terrible situation that happened with the Gaza war.
So there's no doubt it's contributing. I think we'd have to have a blindfold on, not even blinders. We'd have to have a blindfold on not to see that it's contributing. But what concerns me is that what it did is uncover things that were there anyway. That our assumptions might have been too simple. And that the depth of the alliance, and it's easy to point in that, but it's not just there. It's not just there. We could say the same thing that in terms of generations. We can say the same things in terms of other subgroups, particularly what's happening on college campuses and the like. There's lots of things that to my mind, the chessboard is shaking a lot, and it's unclear exactly where all the pieces are anymore. And I wanted to bring this up for that reason. Okay, now I want to go to the most famous rabbinic passage of them all. I didn't reproduce the Aramaic for you. If you want to see the Aramaic, it's in here. All right, so in the Talmud, we get a famous story. You know my definition of what makes something famous?
You know.
If I know it, it must be famous. That's not even original. I got that from my friend and colleague, Steve Bob. He's a rabbi, Steve Bob. And that's actually, his last name is Bob. His name is not like Billy Bob his name is Stephen Bob. He's the one who taught me that. So I give him credit every time I say it. And this is the famous story of the prospective convert who comes to Rabbi Shammai, right? In the time that we're talking about, before the Mishnah, there's these two leading rabbis, and they are each the head of a school of rabbis. One is called Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai, and the other is called Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel. Beit Shammai tends to be strict in its construction of the law, its understanding of the law. And usually we say Beit Hillel is more liberal, more relaxed, more flexible in its understanding of the law, certainly the application of the law.
Didn't that result from their positions in the Sanhedrin? I mean, Hillel was the Nasi and Shammai was the Av Bet Din.
He was number two.
They had two different roles.
Well, but also, one was number one was number two, but the debate, actually what I just described has more to do with their students than with them. In terms of this strict construction versus more loose construction. However, it all comes from this story. There's other stories, but this story, you'll recognize it. The prospective convert comes to Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, and says to them, I want to become Jewish. I want you to convert me while I'm standing on one foot. Right?
Isn't that a bad translation?
No, that is not a bad translation.
Most people will tell me that it means give me a concise definition of what Judaism is
Yes.
all about.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's, the idiom is while standing on one foot. How
That
long
sounds,
can,
that sounds
I know
better.
that you're getting your knee replaced, but how long can you stand on one foot? Do you do Pilates? I am told by somebody I live with that if only I did Pilates, I'd be able to stand on one foot longer. It's not motivating. However, do you get the point? And it happens that Shammai has a builder's cubit, is the way it's translated. It says he's got a measuring stick in his hand, and he pushes him off. Get out of here. Get away, right? It's in the story there if you want to see at the top what's marked page 4. So does the guy give up? He doesn't give up. He goes to Hillel. And he says to Hillel, I want to be Jewish. Convert me while standing on one foot. And this is where Hillel's liberal cred comes from. He says, I'm going to tell you succinctly in one line, sort of. And actually, I'm going to tell you in advance, what I'm about to read to you is a bad translation. He says, the negative version of the golden rule. The positive version of the golden rule is do unto others as you would have others do unto you, right? We all learned that somewhere around kindergarten or first grade. It's a lie, by the way. You didn't learn everything you need to know in kindergarten. He says it the opposite. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. But then he adds something. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn it. We usually forget the second part. But first of all, it was something of a lie when I told you, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. The word is not neighbor in the Aramaic. It's chevrach, which is from the word chaver. Do we know the word chaver? Friend. Bill Clinton referred to Yitzhak Rabin. Remember in the funeral, you remember back in the night, he said, Shalom Chaver. That was a button that everybody was wearing. Okay, the Aramaic of this is, Chavrach is your friend, your Chaver. Now that changes it. When you translate what is hateful to you, do not do to your friend. Who's your friend? Maybe now you can see why I wanted to start with the materials that we started with, which is, what is our obligation in society? Is our friend our immediate family? Is our friend our extended family? Is our friend our tribe? Is our friend our people? Is our friend our nation, the country we live in, humanity? Who's our friend? That we're not supposed to do what's hateful to that person. Sort of makes a difference how you define the word, doesn't it?
I thought it made quite a sword in the hand of Joe Biden when he kept referring to his political enemy as my friend.
But that was ironic, right? In this case, I'm assuming that the text is not ironic, right? That the text is trying to say something to us. Now, what I like about all the rest is commentary, go and learn it. I think the definition of who your friend is could be part of the commentary. And already Hillel understands that what I'm saying, you want me to tell you the essence of Judaism in one sentence. Okay, I'll do it. However, wink, wink, there is no essence of Judaism in one sentence. We have to parse every word. We have to figure it out. We have to apply it in every situation. We have to ask a million questions. We have to look at the tradition. We have to add to the tradition. We have to set all of it. And so he says, rest is commentary, go learn it. What he's willing to do is to trust this prospective convert. He says, okay, I'll convert you, but you have to go study. As opposed to saying, no, you got to prove yourself first, then I'll convert you. That's what makes Hillel a liberal, if we want to use the word liberal with a small L. Is he understood psychologically. This influenced me tremendously throughout my career. It seemed to me that when somebody wanted to talk to me about conversion, and they were serious, once I got past the person who came to see me about conversion because he was convinced that if he was converted to Judaism, he would be rich because all Jews are rich. It's a syllogism. All Jews are rich, I'll be Jewish, I'll be rich. He didn't understand the logical fallacy called asserting the consequent, but it's that I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who were serious. Then you don't put roadblocks in front of them. You help move this forward, making sure that they're serious, making sure they themselves really want to do this and they understand what they're getting into. But then you assume that the real effort is after the fact, not before the fact. It's a whole different way of looking at things. Shammai, if you want to follow this interpretation, in a sense was saying, you're not serious. I'm not talking with you. You have to show me that you're serious over some significant period of time in significant way, and then I'll talk. See, those are two very different ways of viewing the world. But I'm still back to the same question. Who's our friend? So I'm not going to put words in his mouth, and he may be watching this. Tom may be watching this. But if Tom were here, I know how he would define it. And he would be completely within an acceptable traditional way of defining it, based upon Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis, that we're all created in the image of God. And so everybody in that sense is your friend. Everybody is connected on that level. Other people have other definitions. Okay, so let's look at a little of this. I want to look at Maimonides. Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. Do we know what the Mishnah Torah is? Joel.
It's concise.
Well, so what Maimonides did is he understood that most people, even most rabbis, were not going to master all of the tradition. He's in the 12th century. We're not going to master everything up to him. He wanted to write a summary, if you will, of all the halacha.
Like 10,000 volumes.
Compared to the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Midrash and all the responses and everything else up to this point, he condensed it. And so he writes laws, and it's still considered authoritative to this day. It is not the authoritative. There were other codes. The most important one is the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century, Joseph Caro. That becomes the authoritative code once it is adapted for Ashkenazi Jews. But this is still important stuff. This is still studied today. Maimonides also was a great philosopher, and he wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide of the Perplexed, which is called the Guide of the Perplexed because if you start to read it, you will be perplexed. I'll tell you that for sure. You agree with that, do you?
110%.
Okay. However, in the yeshivot, they don't read the Guide of the Perplexed. That's where the real Maimonides is. They study this, the halacha. But you can learn a lot of stuff from his halachic material. So what does he say? He knows it is permissible to have a Canaanite slave perform, I don't like this translation, excruciating labor. It's befarach, which means labor with vigorous labor. The Israelites in Egypt are described as having to do labor befarach, vigorously. So excruciating is, but although this is the law, the attribute of piety and the way of wisdom, in other words, if you're really pious, if you're really wise, for that person, you should be merciful and pursue justice, not to make the slaves carry a heavy yoke, nor cause them distress. He should allow them to partake of all the food and drink he serves. Cruelty and arrogance are found only among idol-worshiping Gentiles. Like, did you get that? Cruelty and arrogance. I would love to be able to introduce it to some Jews I know. Anyway, the cruelty and arrogance are found only among idol-worshiping Gentiles. By contrast, the descendants of Abraham, our patriarch, that is, Jews, whom the Holy One, blessed be God, granted the goodness of the Torah and commanded to observe righteous statutes and judgments, are merciful to all. And similarly, with regard to the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be God, which God commanded us to emulate, it is written in Psalms, God's mercies are upon all of God's works, and whoever shows mercy to others will have shown mercy to him, as implied by Deuteronomy. God will show you mercy and be merciful upon you and multiply you. What is Maimonides saying in his legal work? What is the law? You can work your slave vigorously. But if you're a human being, let alone a Jew, what are you going to do?
Take good care of them.
You're going to treat him like a member of the family. Maimonides, 12th century, in his legal material, not in the Morah, not in philosophy. This is what he is teaching Jews are the rules. Now, this is very hard to live up to, I think. To say you're going to treat everybody like a member of your family. Do we actually do that? If we're honest, I can't say I do that.
I think some people go out of their way to try.
All right, so a really good way to interpret this, I think, is he's saying this is what you're supposed to try.
My uncle is a rabbi and a PhD type doctor. And I asked him what he's doing, and he said, I still live in my big house in New York, but I have rooms and live like a family with 2 graduate students. And I think it's a way to keep the conversation going.
Okay.
And there's a degree to which you can't keep fooling a bunch of graduate students like that.
Yeah, graduate students are particularly difficult. But if you look at this, Maimonides is making a very big statement about who Chevrach is, who your friend is. And I think he wants to say it's everybody. And that even if you have the right to treat somebody a certain way, that doesn't mean that you should treat a person that way.
So are you saying Maimonides and Tom would get along very well?
At least in this passage. At least in this passage. Okay, so now we're going to look at a long passage. And it's a little difficult on the next page. What the page is marked 9 at the bottom. And so we may have to explain some things along the way. So if we read something, stop me if it's like, wow, we're in the weeds here, I'm not understanding anything, okay? So the mission, right? In the Talmud, you start with the mission. Up to the year 200, Rich.
Do we have a track thing?
Do I have a track date? I do. What I didn't do is I didn't copy the Aramaic because I didn't want to waste the paper. It is Baba Kama. Baba Kama, there are 3 tractates in the Talmud. One is Baba Batra, Baba Metzia, Baba Kama. Baba Kama is the front gate, Baba Metzia is the middle gate, Baba Batra is the back gate.
What about Baba Sutra?
How long were you waiting to say that? You were staring at it for at least 10 seconds. And so the gates, it's a way, and this material is not material that normally I would be bringing to you because it's filled with business kind of stuff. And if you're a business lawyer, you like this kind of stuff. So in the Mishnah, with regard to an ox of a Jew that gored a consecrated ox, and conversely, a consecrated ox that gored a non-sacred ox, the owner of the ox is exempt from paying compensation. As it is stated, and if one man's ox hurts the ox of another in Exodus. So that should have lost you already. What is a consecrated ox?
One dedicated to the temple. sacrifice.
One dedicated to the temple. So in other words, if Joel has an ox and he says publicly, I dedicate this ox to the temple, it's not really Joel's ox anymore. It's now God's ox. It's the temple's ox. And so it falls into a whole new category legally about what can be done with it and how things can be done with it. And what if something happens to it? What do you have to do? Right? All this kind of stuff. You can imagine law after law after law, all this kind of stuff growing all out of consecrated objects. And what do we do about them? And so what you have here is what happens is a Jew owns an ox and that ox gores another ox. But it's not just any old ox. It's a consecrated ox, which means it's God's ox. Or what if you have a consecrated ox that gores a non-consecrated ox? You see, they're setting up the problems. Okay. It is derived from the phrase, the ox of another, that one is liable only if it is a non-sacred ox, but not if it is a consecrated ox, which belongs to the temple treasury. If it's a consecrated ox, whose ox is it? It's God's. So therefore, it's not the ox of another. You see how they're playing the game? We can spend hours on this if you want, but really, I don't think we want to. Okay. With regard to the ox of a Jew that gored the ox of a Gentile, the owner of the ox is exempt from liability. The ox of another. Another what? Who's your friend? Who is your community? Right? So if the Gentile is outside of that circle, the law doesn't apply to that Gentile. So therefore, if a Jewish ox gores a Gentile ox, so to speak, there's no liability. The Jew doesn't have liability.
This is Jewish law?
Yeah. What do you think we're studying? Greek law?
Well, no, because I'm trying to think under like a civil law or whatever, it seems like he'd be responsible, but under this, he's not.
There's a special group that's responsible for circumcising the Jewish ox.
Actually, Joel studied that tractate. He knows a lot about it.
So ox goring must have been a big thing back
Well, no,
then.
think of no. All right, so I do not going to pretend that I know anything about oxen. However, we just came from a horse farm where our oldest son, our daughter-in-law, and their 3 kids, our grandchildren, live on a horse farm. Her father's is a horse veterinarian, and they live there. And these horses injure each other all the time. They're capable of injuring each other all the time. They bump into each other. And I am certain they don't have any horns. So I can just imagine what happens with animals with horns as you're hurting them, and all sorts of things could happen. So I don't think this is far-fetched, actually. My guess is it actually was in their experience. I don't know that, but I think it's a reasonable position to take.
Probably not gonna write it if it doesn't something that happens.
I'm sorry?
They're not gonna write this down, they're gonna bother if it's not happening frequently.
Well, sometimes they go off on the unbelievable flights of imagination and tangents that are hard to believe.
A congregant in one of my student pulpits had experience with oxen and said this is very much accurate.
Yeah, these kind of things happen. It's not like one necessarily, it could be that an ox intends to gore another, but it could be just accidental. And this is something with animals. We have close friends in Israel who had is the plural of Sharpei? They had two Sharpeis, which are remarkably ugly and can be very mean dogs. They loved them. All right? And one of them regularly bit the other for no reason. She was referred to as the monster. But she would just bite the dog. Animals do these kinds of things.
Yep.
Okay. With regard,
Short-horned cattle are a very modern breed.
yeah,
Cattle of the biblical times would have had long horns that would have been just in common, grouping them together would have hurt each other.
saying that in the Talmud, all the cattle came from Texas. Or they went to school at Texas.
Man, how many of us in here have ox?
No hands.
Okay. With regard to an ox of a Jew that gored the ox of a Gentile, the owner of the ox is exempt from liability. But with regard to the ox of a Gentile that gored the ox of the Jew, regardless of whether the goring ox was innocuous or forewarned, the owner of the ox pays the full cost of the damage. No bells are going off?
Yeah, they get them into the bet then.
Sound good.
No, so even let's keep in mind what we want to look at this is from the point of view of theory. So what they're saying is within the Jewish group, we have obligations to each other, but not to them. However, if they hurt us, they have obligations to us. We don't have obligations to them. They have obligations to us. This is a little different than Maimonides.
But it ignores the fact there's a civil authority out there above.
Of course there is, but the Talmud is assuming it's the authority. I mean, that's the worldview that it's promoting. It, of course, there's civil authorities. They had to deal with the Romans, or they had to deal with the Greeks before them, and they had to deal with the Persians. But from the Talmud's perspective, this is an enclosed system. That's why I'm suggesting we not look at it from a strictly practical point of view, but ask what is the theory that is operating.
Is the theory also then that the Gentiles are gonna pay attention to this
I
and
think
follow
not.
the law? Okay, doesn't make any sense to me.
I think maybe they have very gullible Gentiles.
It's the same ones
You know,
contributing to the Jewish community.
they went like that.
Yeah.
Look at that, your ox scored mine, you have to pay. I don't have to pay you, but you have to pay me. Yeah, that's what was going on.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going. Because this gets more interesting. With regard to an ox of a Jew that gored an ox of a Gentile, the owner of the ox is exempt from liability, whereas if the Gentile's ox gores the Jew's ox, the owner is liable to pay the full cost of the damage. The sages said, this statement is difficult, whichever way you look at it. If the phrase of another is meant in a precise manner, which means in a limited manner, when a Gentile's ox gores that of a Jew, he should also be exempt from liability, right? If he's other, not in the group, if the Jew doesn't have to pay because the guy's other, he shouldn't have to pay because he's not part of the Jewish group. That's what they're saying. And if the phrase of another is not meant in a precise manner, then even when a Jew's ox gores that of a Gentile, the owner of the ox should be liable, right? And what's good for the goose is good for the gander, whether you read it narrowly or broadly, is what they're saying. They understand their own law. Okay. Rabbi Abahu said that the reason for this ruling is that the verse states, God stood and shook the earth, God beheld and made the nations tremble. Now, I doubt that you knew that verse. I certainly didn't. It's from Habakkuk. When was the last time any of you read Habakkuk? I am guessing never.
Never.
I'm sure the Bible.
What is it?
It's a prophet. He's one of the prophets. One of the minor prophets, which means a short book. He's only one chapter. Okay? But There's 3 chapters in. Habakkuk 3:6, meaning that God saw the 7 mitzvot that the descendants of Noah accepted upon themselves to fulfill, and since they did not fulfill them, God arose and permitted their money to the Jewish people. Did you get that move?
No.
Oh, their money, meaning the Gentiles' money?
All right, so remember, the law is they have to pay if they gore the Israelite ox, but not the other way around. So he has to justify that. So he's using the verse from Habakkuk, which says that the nations trembled, to mean that because they accepted the 7 Noahide laws and didn't fulfill them, as punishment, God said, the Jews get your money. Now, there's one problem with this reasoning. Among many, one problem I want to focus on. Where is it written anywhere that the nations of the world accepted the 7 Noahide laws?
Yeah.
God imposed it upon them.
Where does it say
But
they
they
accepted it?
That is a different story.
No place.
Why
He's
should
just
they have to accept it? It's not a contract.
It is. It is. The 613 mitzvot that we have is a contract.
That's our contract with God.
God proposed it. We said it was not a contract. Every lawyer will tell you it takes 2 to make a contract. You have to have 2 parties to make a contract. We agreed when we said na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will obey. What I just said is, I don't know any place where the second party of this contract ever agreed. And so the reasoning here is faulty. But the argument is, yes, we have something weird in our law, but the reason for it is good, because God is punishing them for something that they need to be punished for. What's the bottom line of that? It enforces a separation between Jews and Gentiles. They are not us. They won't be us. And we're not going to even allow logic to tell us that we have to think of them in the same way we think of us. So Rabbi Yochanan said in the source for this halacha is from here. God appeared on Mount Paran, which in this case means Mount Sinai. Meaning, from the time God came from Mount Paran when giving the Torah, the money of the Gentiles nations appeared. It was revealed and granted to the Jewish people. In other words, this rule comes from Sinai. Okay, do you see the point? Now, the real reason I wanted to give it to you, apart from showing you the complexity of how this thinking goes, and if you really want to know something about rabbinic thought, you actually have to dig into this kind of Jewish law and see really where it takes you. Look, the last paragraph is what's really interesting. The sages taught, and the Roman kingdom once sent 2 military officials to the sages of Israel and ordered them in the name of the king, teach us your Torah. Now, why would the Romans want to know the Torah? What are they looking for? Something subversive.
Insurrection.
Something subversive, right? Insurrection, maybe. The officials read the Torah and repeated it again, reading it for the 3rd time. At the time of their departure, they said to the sages, we have examined your entire Torah, and it is true, except for this one matter that you state, that with regard to the ox of a Jew that gored the ox of the Gentile, the owner is exempt from liability. Whereas regard to the ox of the Gentile that gored the ox of a Jew, whether it was innocuous or forewarned, the owner pays the full cost of the damage. The official's reasoning was that this halacha is difficult whichever way you look at it. If the phrase of another is meant in a precise manner, then even when the ox of the Gentile gores the ox of a Jew, the owner of the ox should be exempt from liability. And if the phrase of another is meant in a precise manner, not in a precise manner, then even when the ox of a Jew gores the ox of a Gentile, the owner should be liable. Right? In other words, they understood this completely. They weren't fooled. The rabbis didn't hide anything from them. They studied all the Torah, all the halakha. They understood the unfairness of this. And what do? And then they added, but will not inform the matter to the kingdom. What are these 2 Roman officials saying to the rabbi?
Yeah, it puts the Gentile down.
It does, and I don't think that's what they're saying.
You can remain apart.
There you go.
remain.
They're saying we're not gonna tell Caesar. If we tell Caesar that you consider yourself separate in this matter, he's gonna assume you consider yourself separate in every matter. And he's then going to fear an insurrection, which he has plenty of reason to fear, because the Jews did rebel in 67 and then did rebel again in the second in 135, in the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And it's like, so they're saying, we're not going to tell them because we want you to be part of the kingdom. Now, I think this makes the Gentiles look very good. They were willing to study, they understood, they asked questions, they didn't impose anything. When they see a big problem and they understand the importance of that problem, they think it's more important that the Jews be part of the kingdom, rather than trouble ensue and there be another putting down of a potential insurrection or suppression of the Jewish people. But that's the end of the passage. That's it. What are we supposed to do with it? What's our conclusion? I think it depends on your bent of mind. Do you want to consider yourself part of a greater whole? That we somehow can be separate? I dedicated my professional life to arguing that the Jewish people needs to be different in order to continue, and somehow we also have to be part of American society. We have to be integrated and we have to be different. And people said, look, sometimes when they understood what I was saying, went, what? It's really, isn't that? Yeah, I think it's living in a tension. It's living with ambiguity. That you have to, and that's the American dilemma.
Is that so different than many other cultural groups? In
I doubt it is. I think it's probably the same, but I can't speak for them.
From an outsider's perspective, it seems like.
But if you look at other cultural groups in America, in the big arc, ultimately what happens to them?
Assimilate.
They assimilate in a nearly, if not absolutely complete way.
But unless there's specific racial differences, then they don't in the same way.
So African Americans couldn't in the same way that Irish.
And yet there's those who think that in the next, 100 years, racially, we will be so much more mixed that there won't be those differences.
But
Wasn't that the same situation with previous, since the emancipation, since Napoleon gave the Jews citizenship? The same kind of phenomenon.
So I think it's exactly the same. Meaning, with Napoleon, the way I put it is we have the advent of the hyphenated Jew. You're no longer a Jew living in France. Now you're either a French Jew or a Jewish Frenchman. Okay. The difference is it's on steroids in America. Because America, not all of America, and there's plenty of examples of this and throughout American history, but at the best in America, America said, we want you. We want you to be part of it here. We want you to be part of our country. We think that we're better with you. That was sort of new. I mean, you had some examples of that in the past, the Golden Age of Spain, a few other times, but this is sort of put it all on the line in a way that it never was before. And so I used to put it cutely, are we American Jews or Jewish Americans? Which one's the adjective and which one's the noun? Because I don't see how it can be equal. That I'm somehow fully Jewish in the sense that I have a separate identity and fully American, fully assimilated. I think that there's middle ground there, but even for us where we all have multiple identities, everybody in this room has multiple identities, right? I have the identity of husband, father, grandfather, rabbi, Jew, American, guitar player, whatever, we all have multiple identities. But which of them are primary? That's the issue. And I think that this last year is what has stirred that all up for us again. And you see it here. Already, in the time of the Talmud, in the Mishnah, 1800 years ago, 1900 years ago, they were struggling with what's the primary identity? How do we navigate this? How do we be both somehow? Because Jews were living with non-Jews. Okay, we have a little bit more time. So on your last page, I wanted to come back to Maimonides. Okay, so you might think that all this will be resolved in the Messianic age. Ultimately, that's the solution, right? In the Messianic age, everything will be solved. And throughout Jewish history, what is the Messianic age is never completely defined. There is no dogma that says, I am a Jew, therefore I believe this about the Messianic age, about what happens after death. You don't get that in Judaism. There are lots and lots of ideas. And Jews have always been happy to talk about this and to share their ideas. But you don't get what I'll call a dogma. The only dogma in Judaism is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai Echad. Because I said that in Hebrew, because you want to translate that alone, one, singular. There's all sorts of ways you can translate that. So even that dogma that we all agree to, right? If a Jew knows 6 Hebrew words, what are the 6 Hebrew words? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. But even that, we don't all agree on exactly what it means.
How do you feel about humanistic Jews?
Humanistic Jews. Okay, so what I should have said is religious Jews of whatever kind of religion. That humanistic Jews generally don't want to talk about God at all. So they have taken themselves out of that equation. And secular Jews often don't want to talk about God and but I meant within the various forms of religious Judaism. You're right. Okay, but what I find here about Maimonides is terrific, in my opinion, about what happens at the end of days, at the end of time, in the Messianic age. Is everything going to be solved? Are we going to solve all these problems? All right, here's what he says. Do not, Maimonides was not shy, do not presume that in the Messianic age, any facet of the world's nature will change, or there will be innovations in the work of creation. Rather, the world will continue according to its pattern. Will anything change when we get to the Messiah? Although Isaiah says, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the young goat. You're familiar with that passage from Isaiah? It's a very important passage because what it says at the end of time, the nature itself will change. Everything will be different. You cannot have wolves and lambs lying down together. Wolves eat lambs. Only if the wolf stops being a wolf can a wolf lie down with a lamb. Only if the leopard stops being a leopard can you have a leopard and a goat. Although I don't know why anybody would want to be with a goat. But you get my point, right? He is saying, don't buy that. That's wrong. That's wrong. Don't listen to Isaiah in its literal words. He says, these words are a metaphor and a parable. This is a standard Maimonides move. The interpretation of the prophecy is as follows. He's going to say, I'm now going to tell you what this parable really means. Israel will dwell securely together with the wicked Gentiles who are likened to a wolf and a leopard. As in the prophecy in Jeremiah, a wolf from the wilderness shall spoil them, and a leopard will stalk their cities. They will all return to the true faith and no longer steal or destroy. Rather, they will eat permitted food at peace with Israel. As Isaiah says, the lion will eat straw like an ox. In other words, the whole thing's a metaphor. The peoples of the world will stop being wicked They'll stop being predators. The word in Hebrew, torfim is the Hebrew. They'll stop being predators and they will be like the Lamb. And then we'll all be able to live together in the world that we all know. Similarly, other messianic prophecies of this nature are metaphors. In the messianic era, everyone will realize which matters were implied by these metaphors and which allusions they contain. The sages and the prophets did not yearn for the messianic era in order to have dominion over the entire world, to rule over Gentiles, to be exalted by the nations, to eat, drink, and celebrate. Rather, they desired to be free, to involve themselves in Torah and wisdom without any pressures or disturbances, so that they would merit the world to come, as explained in another part of his Mishnah Torah called the Laws of Repentance, Hilchot Tshuva. So what is the world, what is Messianic times according to Maimonides? Yeah. Everybody here?
Yeah.
She said kumbaya. So it's that everything will be the same. It's just we won't be fighting with each other anymore. Everybody will get to live their life. No, I can buy this. Not that the Gentiles, the wicked Gentiles that he referred to, but what he was trying to allude to is that the world is filled with aggression. And aggression is the problem. Messianic times is we won't be predators one on the other. Everybody will be able to live, and that will be the meaning of peace. That'll be the meaning of the world to come. Then we won't have the issue that we have. It won't matter whether we're living alone or not. It won't matter who is your friend. It will all be. So why is this valuable? Do I think this is going to happen? I still think it's valuable. And I think it's valuable because it is a way of saying what we want. Not necessarily what we think we're going to get. Not what we think is going to necessarily happen to the world. But if we don't say what we want, for sure we're never getting there. Does that make any sense? If we can't say, this is the goal, how do we, what the whole thing in Gaza has brought this home to me. Until you say what the goal is, you can't know whether you won. You can't know whether you get there. And something realistic, not complete victory, not total victory. The reason I like this Maimonides passage, it's a goal that I can buy into. That I can say, this is worth working for. This is what we want. This is why we try to build those alliances. This is why we want to have a broader definition of chevrach rather than a narrow one. As frustrating as it is and as many steps backwards as we have to go, this is why it's worthwhile. Because we have a clear goal in mind. I thought it was something to think about. Next time, last time, will be the last time, we'll talk about the relationship between the diaspora and Israel, how that might work. But I know that Karen talked about this on Rosh Hashanah. She told me that she did. I'll have a little bit more to say about it because she was influenced by an article that Daniel Hartman wrote, and I've been listening to him for 15 years. So the article is really good, but I might be able to flesh that out a little bit, and we'll be able to think about it in ways, and I'm sure you'll have opinions about it. So, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We finished a little earlier this.